Today, I want to talk about creative, particularly for your app marketing and for your app marketing efforts, whether that's user acquisition or retargeting. So a little bit about Archie and why creative is important to us. So Archie's been around a few years, and we worked in the mobile space. And when I joined, as I mentioned, we started out with a rich media creative authoring platform. And we worked with some of the top games developers in the US who sold direct deals. We worked with them to create these highly engaging, very native rich media experiences, essentially playables before playables were a thing. And what we saw was that time and time again, those who invested in testing their creative and iterating on their creative with their advertisers saw better performance both on the creative and overall on the campaign. But we also saw time and time again that most people were actually also optimizing on the media and the campaign level, and they were doing it in a silo, not taking the creative into account. So what do we do? Well, about 2.5 years ago, actually, we built our own DSP. So we're still working with apps developers, predominantly in the gaming space, a lot of social casino, casual games, as well as other categories, except now we're offering not just creative, but also a unified media buying and creative optimization solution. Because what we actually see is that when you combine those two together, instead of in a silo optimizing, we actually see really strong performance gains that you can't do if you're not doing both at the same time. And I think one of the really important things about how we do media buying that I want to point out is actually that we are a 100% RTB-enabled DSP, because that is very important. When we talk about optimizing creative, as well as especially on media, everyone knows you can read the bit stream for rich signals, where the user is, when you've last seen the user, what device they're on, how often do you see the user, not just across one network, we see it across all exchanges. Those are things that we actually use to inform creative strategy. And then more importantly, since it's all very user-centric, because we're buying on an individual user impression, we're also able to layer on additional data, rich information from our attribution partners through postbacks on how a user behaves post-conversion, audience profiles that we've built out and identified of users across billions of devices around the world. When we're talking about retargeting, that's actually where we can get really interesting and creative, because there, we work with our partners and we know exactly who that user is. We potentially know a lot about them and why they're no longer playing a game or playing a game. And that is also something that can inform your creative strategy. So that's going to be a little bit about today. So I could probably spend hours talking about different tips and techniques for testing creative and how to optimize it. I just want to give a bit of a snapshot of how we approach it, some learnings we've had, both across user acquisition, for those of you who are doing user acquisition, as well as retargeting. Because in fact, just because you know who your user is, doesn't mean that you shouldn't spend as much care and effort re-engaging that user. You've already acquired them once. If you're going to reinvest to re-engage them, invest all the way. Invest in the creative there as well. So user acquisition, there's a lot of things we've learned across user acquisition. Today, I'm mostly going to talk a lot about the process of how we actually go about testing for creative, rather than saying, you must do this, you must do that. One of the things we'll find is actually sometimes trying out things you don't think are going to work, or it's not the done thing, actually leads to unexpectedly positive results. The main thing is as long as you have a process in place for testing. But here are a few key learnings just to start off with. So show your game, show your app. The ad impression, particularly for user acquisition, is many times the first impression, for lack of a better word, that a user will have of your app post-install. So do you want to show them an ad that's going to be completely different than the app experience once they download it? You probably don't, because you're going to have disappointed users who are going to churn. If you have ads that are consistent with the gameplay, highlight key aspects of it, what we find is that actually those users that you convert through those ads end up being much better quality. They stick with the game longer. Essentially, you're being truthful for the users of what they're going to experience once they've taken the effort to download your game. Some other things to think about, particularly for for those of you who are in a position where maybe you're working with multiple titles in your portfolio, you have strong brand knowledge. Something I think in the gaming space not always everyone thinks about is think about leveraging your brand identity. A potentially counterintuitive example, as I mentioned, we're going to pepper these in, is, we worked with Pop Slots, Play Studios, right? Here I am showing a lot of casino apps showing, multipliers, slots, but actually they have a really strong brand equity in their Mirage Girl avatar. Very different than a lot of other games in their space. So what we found was that by testing out a very different creative, because they had such strong brand equity, we actually saw really strong conversion lifts, actually 20% higher than sort of what we might call our more typical standard best performing slots creative. And then finally, the most important thing, it's not enough to show your game. Show something exciting in it. Make an emotional connection. There's lots of moves in a game. Not all of them are as equal as, the winning strategy, clearing the board, or feeling the win. And actually, we see that concept go through not just into games, but even social networking, where we worked with a partner of ours who was where we actually focus on some of the utility that app has around real-time news and staying connected with current events. It was a very emotional connection, but it was also a very strong connection with what the app is going to give them, as a user once they've downloaded it. So these are pretty general learnings. We get a lot more specific when we get down to each individual campaign level. And now I'm going to actually talk to you about our process. So there's lots of different ways, and probably you might have already seen talks about multivariate testing, leveraging different formats. We're going to get all into that, but this is how we get there. So for user acquisition, from a creative and a media perspective, we often start out with a similar way. We tend to start out with key supply sources and formats that we know will work well. But from a creative perspective, actually, when we first start out a campaign, it depends, in this case, we've worked with King and other titles of theirs, so we actually leverage previous learnings from similar titles. But what we actually find is that we start out with a couple of different creative concepts. And then we do a lot of champion and challenger testing and iterate from there. And the reason we start out with different creative concepts, because we actually want to get a sense of what overall message will resonate with the potential target audience. And then, as we're testing, we're slowly on the media side scaling up. And we're going to have more audience, more supply. And that's when we can actually start getting into some of the more, testing of CTA, the kind of the traditional multivariate testing. So what does it look like? So here, as I said, we actually started out this campaign. We had some learnings from some similar titles. So in this type of category, we know gameplay obviously works. It's showing key elements of the game. Users will know what they're going to get when they download the game. But actually, we know that the boosters really engage people. It gets them, draws them in. Is it because the excitement of clearing the board? So we started out with 3 different creatives with gameplay, with boosters, with different combos. And then we saw very clearly, pretty early on, that unfortunately Strawberry was not as popular amongst our users. But we actually saw that 2 of the creatives actually, in different ways, this one, they both contain the Superfruit booster, which is this multicolored booster. One treatment had really strong CTR lift. The other treatment had really strong conversion lift. So what are we going to do? From a testing perspective, what we would do right now is actually we kept both of these running. But as I said, we're constantly want to test out different concepts, because at the same time while we're getting new creatives into market, we're expanding our supply, we're launching new ad formats. So a lot of these are rich media M-rate interstitials, we're expanding to video, rewarded video, playables. So we're still keeping these creatives in market because we see potential from both of them, but we always constantly rotate in a new challenger, generally at least once a week. And in this case, we decided to try something that also leveraged learnings we've had from past video and rich media creatives, which is using boosters and a combination of moves can also sometimes work really well. And what we saw here actually was that the 2 creatives, the 2 original sort of champion creatives were still there neck and neck, each strong in their own area. So what do we decide? Well, actually, it looks like, right, the 2 creatives, which one do you pick? Conversion rate or CTR? Both of those were really strong up-funnel metrics. But the benefit of having sort of run this champion challenger test as we scaled media is that by this point, we've been in market long enough that we had lots of mature cohorts to look back at. And because we're able to tie creative to performance on to performance and look at ROI, user retention, user engagement on a creative level, not just on a campaign level, we were actually able to see that overall, this creative was bringing in much stronger users. So, okay, great. We've reached scale, now what? Do we still keep running this? So a little bit of mix-up. So this is another creative that we ran. And this was, for that campaign, the original one here, the champion. And while we're still going to continue doing champion challenger testing, let's talk about what happens when we've reached scale and we've got a really strong champion creative. This is the point at which we start doing testing on different elements, whether that's CTA, background, testing combinations of these elements. And the reason we tend to do this once we've reached scale is, as I mentioned, we've got mature cohorts. Another thing is we're reaching a lot more people. We've got proven performance, which means that when we test out these potentially smaller changes, we can understand the impact of those changes much faster than when we start out, right away on a fresh campaign. And there we saw, actually, go back. So we changed the CTA to red. We tested out red. We started with pink, brand colors, brand assets. Next, we tested out CTA color to red. We had a massive uplift in CTR, as well as other metrics. So the next step we were able to do is then, step by step, essentially break down a champion creative and understand what element of that champion creative really was grabbing the users. Is it changing the background color? We've been using these really awesome boosters, the Choco Bomb, for any of you who are playing this game, which clears the board in this massive zap of electricity. It's great. But you know what? The striped lollipop is also pretty cool. So we wanted to see if maybe that would be as exciting to users. Maybe is it the lollipop? Or is it the positioning? Is it the sight, sound, and motion? And when we've reached scale, we're actually able to start doing this testing. And that's a big, important part of the process because, don't forget about testing out creative concepts and then doing this testing in concert because you get wins in a couple of different ways. You get those champion creatives right away, and then there's the incremental wins that you're able to slowly build up over time that actually sustains and grows the performance of your campaign even as you keep running it. It keeps users from being worn out by the same creative. It allows you to try different concepts and essentially keep things fresh. And I know this seems obvious, but I like to always put this in there when thinking about creative, particularly for those of you who are thinking about starting to run global campaigns, but you're worried about, what am I going to do when I want to reach global users? Localization is actually really important, but localization in markets you don't think is important is where we actually see the importance. So yes, you're probably going to want to localize your market to Japanese in Japan, and Russian in Russia. But oftentimes, we see the ads. Some people say, oh, you're in a country where there's a really high English literacy rate. Am I going to spend the money and the effort to localize? We say yes, because as I mentioned, sometimes it's these incremental gains. So here, there's definitely a big uptick in conversion rate and CTR. But even in the Nordics, we might not see a massive CTR uplift in a localized creative versus an English creative, but what we're actually seeing is that when we look at the down funnel events, that the user quality is much better. It's worth investing in. If you're not localizing, work with your partners, such as ourselves. So because we see the performance value on these campaigns, oftentimes we find ourselves working with translation companies so that we can now localize. I think we're almost at 30 languages and counting. You start localizing to Spanish, Portuguese, German, you're not only just reaching audience in Spain and Mexico, you're opening up LATAM. With Portuguese, you're actually able to reach users, in Africa if you're running global campaigns. If you have the opportunity to leverage a creative you've already made and send it and localize it in those markets with French, go ahead and do it. You've already invested. I could probably go on and on and on about all the cool things you can do with testing and different formats and bringing in native and playables. But I also want to make sure that we cover retargeting today since we have a short amount of time. And retargeting is actually where you can actually get really creative with your messaging because you know a lot about the user. And for those of you who are thinking, I'm doing retargeting, but I don't necessarily know that much about your user, You don't necessarily have to have, ideally segmented audiences. You can do a lot just with some interesting creative strategies. So a couple of things, it's not just about the creative message format. So when we start our retargeting campaign from a creative perspective, we look at it very differently than user acquisition. Your goals are different, and your creative strategies should be different. Particularly, you're thinking about, what are you thinking about retargeting? You want to maximize your match rate. You want to reach every single user on your list that you think is important to you. There's a lot of ways to do it. Buy unused supply sources, work with lots of different partners. Creative is actually really important as well to doing that. So maybe some formats might not necessarily work as well for you in user acquisition. They do and can work when you're talking about retargeting. So go deep into native, go deep into other formats that you might not use on a day-to-day basis. You can also start talking about things about your app, news, promos. They don't necessarily make sense to someone who's not familiar with your brand, the experience, but if you're looking to reach users who maybe haven't played your game in a while, this is a great opportunity to message them about specific updates to the game. Why blast them with just standard, user acquisition messaging, reminding them that the app exists when you can remind them and getting into personalization. Maybe you don't want to say, hey, I saw you got stuck at level 573, but maybe you can mention that, there's some new combos available that'll help you get past whatever that boss was that that a user in that cohort got stuck on. So here are some examples, and actually, so one of the other companies we work with quite a lot is Playrix, and this is an interesting one because when we actually first started out working with them from a retargeting and re-engagement perspective, we started out before, and while it's developed and progressed, we started out necessarily without knowing as much about the various users and why they might have lapsed from the game. And this is where we tried a couple of different creative strategies for retargeting to see what performed well. So a couple of things. Actually, I talked about the emotional connection in user acquisition around the feeling the win, feeling the excitement. Retargeting, sometimes that emotional connection of you've loved this game. I mean, here we've got the sad puppy. It turns out not many people can resist the sad puppy that's been a companion with them in the game. So we remind users about that they used to love the game and highlight things that we know people would get excited about and connect it to. The other thing was, and there's a couple of different options there. So we have it, Austin's down feeling you back. You've got the puppy on his own, puppy with gameplay. Another thing we've decided was that actually when we updated this creative when they had new levels and new live opportunities available. Because the hypothesis is that maybe some users just stopped playing the game because they've completed it. They've really loved it, and they've completed it. So it's not that they wanted to lapse, it's just that there wasn't any new challenges left for them. So the minute we know that there's something new in a game, we can rotate in that message specifically to that segment. And then finally, timely messages. If you're doing anything in your game, we can message live ops. We can also message seasonal events, particularly if that seasonality is going to carry on through into the app. They're all really good opportunities for testing out for retargeting. And in this case, as I mentioned, the emotional play definitely performed really well. But for this app in particular, early on in our re-engagement strategy, we actually find messaging users about new opportunities within the app, new levels and new ops did the best to re-engage people. So here we did a bit of hypothesis, but the thing is about why users might have dropped off and why they might have lapsed. So we actually are doing a lot of experimentation now that's ongoing for cases where we know a lot about the user. So if you know that a user might have gotten frustrated, are they just stuck on a level and they're not able to get past a level compared to their peers? Or have they just gotten really high and there's nowhere else for them to go? You can actually start bringing that into your creative messaging. So things like, so some of the examples of this, for users who have gotten stuck on a level, we've been experimenting with giving them messaging about, different combos, highlighting them. If there's some promo in the store where you can get multiple boosters or extra lives for a time period, that could be a really good incentivization to get someone who really wants to play a game but just has gotten stuck, potentially pass and be able to move on to their next milestone. For someone who's gotten really high and we're really valuable users, you can start thinking about, highlighting all the new levels you've released since you've last seen that user. And then I've talked a lot about the creative side, because we said it's not about just optimizing the creative in a silo. You also need to think about the media side. So with each creative that we've targeted to a user, that we've segmented, we also can think about, our bid strategy. You might have users of differing potential value. So not only are we serving creatives to users based on, why we think they've lapsed and what messaging we think will get them back into the game, but our bidding strategy is also taking into account the potential value of a user after they've re-engaged. So for users we think are potentially able to balance volume with cost effectiveness. So really high potential users, we may bid more aggressively for them. For users that we think will still perform well after we've re-engaged them, but have not historically been such high value users, our strategy there is to acquire them more efficiently, potentially at a lower cost than other users. And with this, the combination of creative and the media optimization is how we're actually able to drive really strong performance for retargeting. We're not treating a retargeting segment as just one group, from either creatively or from a media perspective. So I mentioned sometimes you need to experiment and do things you don't expect. So, if you have audience segments, trying to leverage that seems like a no-brainer. Testing creative, doing multivariate testing, trying different CTAs, localizing. Okay, I'm sure you're probably thinking that makes sense. So one of the things you've noticed was experimentation has been key to us, and having a system of experimenting. So we actually decided to experiment with retargeting and try playables. And everyone thinks playables, it's a shoo-in for user acquisition. As I mentioned, you want to show the game, you want to have people understand what they're downloading. Actually, it also works for retargeting. Sometimes maybe people need to be reminded about why they left a game and what they liked about the game by giving them a chance to play it again. And we actually saw that, when we looked at our other retargeting creative and we added playables into the mix, that for certain segments, that playables actually show an improvement in performance, not just in initial app metrics, but after the users have become re-engaged for a while. I'm going to wrap up on that because I think there's one key takeaway or a couple of key takeaways I want everyone to walk out with, which is, experiment with your data. You've got all this data. You've got a lot of knowledge around, hopefully, around your media campaigns, your audience, what's going on in your games in terms of live ops, new levels, seasonal promotion. All of that should be leveraged for your creative. Work with your creative team, work with your partners, your marketing partners' creative teams, and think about what you can do around that rich data for the creative. And more importantly, experiment. Because the worst thing that's going to happen when you experiment is that you're going to learn something. And you know what? You can never go wrong with learning something. Sometimes you learn that playables work for retargeting. Sometimes you may learn that gender, trying different creatives by gender may not perform as well as you do. But whatever happens, you know that you now have something that you can iterate on and do new tests on. So that is how you can leverage creative as well with your media strategy to actually improve your app marketing performance.
How do you think GDPR will affect retargeting in case we need to share any device IDs as a user acquisition manager? So that is the main concern for me. That's
the main concern. So that's actually, I think we've all been in the thick of GDPR-related related questions. So whether it's from user acquisition or retargeting, so user acquisition could be suppression list. A couple of ways. So one is, as Archie, we work with a couple of parties as a data processor. So it could be yourself as a games developer, as well as our exchange partners. So right now, we're seeing a couple of things in the market where, obviously from the supply side, everything that we do is user-based, right? We're optimizing on a user. So we leverage the device and user information from our supply sources for our bidding models. We have been working with them to understand if they are able to get direct consent or able to get consent from the publisher and pass it to us as a DSP. So right now, we are essentially working with them to make sure that they have the controls in place to pass user information. Working with our advertiser partners, if you do have GDPR compliant user consent, we have found that, in talking with our teams, that you can still pass that to us. As Archie, in handling data, we have gone through a lot of preparation to be compliant in the way we store and process data, and have gone through and have actually put in systems in place where right now the IAB has launched standards for OpenRTB around passing user consent and consent data. For advertiser partners, as well as our attribution partners, we also have developed systems in place where you can actually send us automated requests to delete a user where you've received a user deletion request, which can be done via an API. Right now, what we are seeing is that in many cases, we are still working with device IDs and are also looking at alternative methods to support for folks who might not be able to pass as device IDs in the future. But yeah, the big one is for us is that we want to be really prepared that we can respect an advertiser's request to us to delete user data, and we've put a lot of effort into that.
You mentioned that localization produced an uplift in CTR and CVR. Was there increase in user quality?
Yes. So obviously, we want to work with our partners. So the reason we localize everything, I know we show a lot of CTR and CR, but as I said, if you looked at the example of what was our champion creative, all of that is determined on post-install event. So that could be ROI, user quality in terms of retention, loyalty, opens. So that is actually our key metric for essentially all of our advertisers. So when we say localization improves performance, well, we're actually saying that localization improves performance in those down funnel metrics, which you can probably understand what type of metrics we're talking about in terms of return.
Hi, thanks for the presentation. I was wondering, in the example you gave with the sad puppy thing, you were actually targeting the player that left the game, right?
Yes.
How do you actually connect with those players? How do you reach them once they're out of the game?
So that's actually ties into the GDPR question. So there's a couple of ways we can work. So we work in many ways with understanding who a user is a lapsed user. That could be directly from understanding users through our advertiser partners, in this case, Gardenscapes. Because we've also been running the campaign, for several months and working with attribution providers, we also have an understanding of, what users were active in the game and what users may not be active in the game. So all of that combined is how we identify users that are potential for retargeting. The important thing is we're lucky with some of our partners are able to work very closely together, and we can work with them to now segment out this retargeting user pool, because ideally, just because you don't necessarily want to target every single user who's lapsed. You want to be efficient with your investment. So if you can layer on the lapsed user with other attributes, it could be spend. Spend obviously is an important one. Your high spending VIP users, but there could be other sort of intermediate profile signifiers that can mean someone's a high quality user. Maybe they haven't spent yet, but if you know that users get to a certain level, if you can then kind of move that user over to a certain level, then you might know that they'll have a more propensity to turn to spend. So that's what I meant also about where you can then optimize your bidding for users where you're not necessarily where you have levels of confidence in how strong their spend potential is. You want to acquire those users more efficiently, more cheaply essentially, than for users where you know that there's going to be a really strong return.
Okay, well, thank you so much. That's great.